Hello and welcome back to Hudson Auto Films. Today you join me back working on the 4x4 Supercar. If this is your first time watching, we are combining a Land Rover Discovery and a 2007 Aston Martin Vantage. I recommend watching the earlier episodes, but to summarise, so far I have stripped the Land Rover down to its chassis. I then somehow managed to get the Aston onto the Land Rover, started chopping out the floor, bringing the Aston body lower on the Land Rover chassis. Last week I went to town and put on a bunch of body panels, so this thing really does look like a car, finally. I also did a lot of cutting to make these massive wheels fit. So this thing is really starting to come together. And today we have even more exciting work to do. So I'm going to move you around to my whiteboard and I will show you the plan. Please try and look past this very professional setup and any illicit drawings that have not been rubbed out properly. So, to start with, intro. Cool. First proper thing on the agenda is we are going to put the car back on dollies. We're then going to jack up the Aston slightly. Then that will allow us to move the Land Rover on the dollies underneath the Aston body just to make sure the positioning is perfect. Get it millimetre perfect, this way, that way, so everything is sitting as perfectly as it can. Then we are going to make proper body mounts. I've got a bunch of steel in and a bunch of new nuts and bolts, so we'll have this thing properly mounted by the end of this episode. Then after that I'm going to remove the radiator, put the hinges on the bonnet, get that all mounted properly. Then we'll have a proper idea at what angle the radiator has to sit for it to fit properly with the Aston bonnet. Then I'm going to do a few other bits and bobs like fitting the tonneau cover properly. I have the hinges for that. I also want to put the dash frame in, and I also want to cut out the center console. So a bunch of stuff, but the main thing today is getting this body properly mounted and everything looking good. So let's get cracking. Okay, so after just moving the car around, squaring it up with the building, I walked around and kind of just wanted to gauge exactly where the body is sitting, how straight is it. So even though we got the body pretty square to the chassis a couple of episodes ago, since then the car has been rolled back in and there's quite a big lip coming into this building and it definitely bounced a little bit. There is a couple of bolts securing the body at the back, but the front is still kind of fair game. So basically I think when it came into the building, it bounced, the body is moved a little bit. So in technical terms, the body is on the piss. So let me show you how I can see that, and then I'll show you the solution to fixing that. A very rudimentary test, however, if I take you here to the arch, you'll see I've got 3 fingers from the tyre to the corner of the Aston arch. However, if I take you round to the passenger side, it immediately looks very different in real life, but as you can see, I can put my whole hand in there, and yeah, so a complete extra finger. I know it's a very technical measurement, but yeah, you can really see it in real life as well. And then a slightly more precise way of checking, I'm picking a point on the Land Rover chassis, I'm picking a bolt just here, then I'm measuring from the outside of the Land Rover chassis to the inside of the Aston sill. On this side I'm getting 10.5 inches, and then using exactly the same point on this side I'm getting just over 10. So there's about ½ an inch difference between the sides, which is why this side is so much closer to the wheel than that side. So basically the Aston body needs a little bit of fine tuning. So what I'm going to do is lift the Aston body off the Land Rover chassis just a centimetre or so. Then as all the wheels are on dollies, we can then move the Land Rover chassis independently from the Aston, perfecting the placement, and we can lower the Aston body down onto the Land Rover chassis, measure up. If it's perfect, we can get this thing mounted. Okay, so here is my little system. Not everything is lined up yet, but you should be able to get the idea. So basically the 4 scissor jacks to each side on these beams will lift the Aston body just up a centimetre. It doesn't need to go far. I definitely wouldn't trust this setup, you know, for long-term heavy use, but we just need to move the Aston body up that little bit. Then we can move the Land Rover chassis independently and get everything lined up. Seems simple enough in concept, but let's see how this thing goes. Also, whilst the car is up in the air, I'm going to trim down one of the nubs on the chassis as it is not completely level with the other side. And remarkably, the Aston body is still so rigid, even with everything we've taken out, meaning that the Aston body is tilting as it can't sit completely level on all 4 nubs. Also, we're going to make some relief holes for our guide bolts at the back, meaning we can tighten those up a bit. As then, when it's time to move the front around, we want those to be fairly locked in place so the back doesn't just start going all over the place when we move the front. So let's do this. trouble has arrived.
Hello, YouTube.
Isaac's working on something that you will see in the near future, but we won't talk about that right now. But basically the body is now square, so now we need to make mounts for the front. So let me show you where we're going to do that. As you can see in here, ignore the piece of wood, that's definitely not factory. You can see the massive rectangular piece, which is where the Aston front subframe originally bolted to. And you can also see down there the Land Rover front body mount. So we're going to create a bracket that goes from the Aston mounting point to the Land Rover mounting point, and then we will have our front end fixed. Obviously right now the back end, even though there's bolts through it, it's still loose, so we can move it around, but it's basically where it needs to be. So now it's time to do the same to the front. So we're going to whip the front end off and get cracking. So this is a big moment. We have our first proper body mounts, and as Isaac demonstrated, it is pretty rigid. Sadly, Isaac has had to go, and all that's left of him are his gloves, which are now mine. But Isaac did a hell of a job at making these front mounts. They are incredibly strong. He did want me to reiterate that he is not a pro welder, which I think is unnecessary, as they are incredibly strong. We'll make them look pretty, we'll paint them, that's down the line, but they are bloody brutally strong, and they will stay that way, and they will keep this body right where they are. So a big thank you to Isaac, but now it is time for me to mount the rear end. But before I do that, I'd like to take 1 minute out and talk about today's sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by FlexiSpot. If you're like me, you need a workstation that allows for a diverse range of tasks. And this is where the FlexiSpot E7 standing desk comes in. I need something very robust, and unlike other cheaper desks, the E7 is made out of thick steel. This makes it great from anything from office use all the way up to heavy duty work. I never realized how good a standing desk could be. Not only is it nice to be able to change working positions over a long day, but also having a variable height makes working on certain projects much easier. So whether I'm editing videos or fixing parts, the E7 is up to the task. When I first pulled it out of the box, I was a little bit daunted by the amount of pieces. However, it was actually incredibly easy to set up. It only took me about 25 minutes and it was away. I've been throwing all sorts of things at it the last couple of weeks and it has been brilliant. It's incredibly sturdy and its lifting capacity is massive. I weigh 12 stone and as you can see, it is lifting me up and down like I am nothing. It is actually able to lift over 30 stone, so it is fit for working on even the most heavy parts. Right now they have a crazy Black Friday sale on, so do check them out. I've linked them down below along with the discount codes. Sponsors make episodes like this possible, so please do check them out and consider supporting them. So thank you FlexiSpot, and now let's crack on. What is quite impressive at this stage is the alignment tolerances right now. So even with mounting the front end, which obviously as we tightened up the bolts, that was bound to move the car a little bit, I'm going to insert the front tolerances of the Aston body alignment on the Land Rover chassis. It is pretty remarkable. And then here are the tolerances for the rear end. It's really cool that we've managed to get this to such a fine margin. So those are our margins. However, we've got no idea what the allowance was when the chassis was being made and when the body was being made. I'd imagine the body was pretty accurate, even though there are quite a few shims in places. However, the chassis, I think there was probably quite a high degree of variation. Anyway, let's get going and mount this back end. Welcome to the depths of my rear wheel arch. As you can see, we are very lucky as we have this captive mounting area. It originally housed this bracket from the Aston. I assume something to do with the suspension. The string is not original. This rear area is all part of the crash structure and is incredibly rigid. So the way I see it, the bracket will start here and come down. And as you can see on the Land Rover chassis, we have this pair of matching mounting surfaces. So the goal is to bridge down from here to these. But how are we going to do that? Well, we are going to thread a piece of box section through here, and you guessed it, through here. Unfortunately, I need to do a bit of cutting to get this one in. We can then bolt through these into the box section, and the length of the box section allows us to be level with our Aston mounting surface. This will be especially rigid as we are connecting to 2 points, and the whole bracket goes through and connects to the other side, making an incredibly rigid one-piece bracket. So that is the plan, but in order to do that, we need to clearance this side so we can get the box section in. There's just a few rough bits of cutting from previous clearancing that are overhanging and stopping the beam going through, so we're going to remove those. And whilst I'm at it, I'm also going to remove the remainder of the Aston gearbox tunnel, as it won't be needed in our new floor plan. So, once again, let's get cutting. It's level, thank f***. Well, there we have it. We now have a properly mounted 4x4 supercar. The brackets are bolted down and the car is certainly not going anywhere. However, they're not quite finished. There is some work I need to do off camera, including properly welding up the rear one. It's just tacked at the moment, as you saw. I didn't want to properly weld it until I test fitted it and was able to confirm that it did the job, it fitted just as it needed to, and luckily it does. So I'm going to take that home and weld it up properly. I'm probably not going to film that, as you guys get the overall principle, and you know what welding looks like. You know how bad I am at it, so it's probably not the best segment. Then once that's done, I'm obviously going to clean the brackets up and paint them. There's been a little bit of an ongoing conversation in the comments about aluminium and steel. Obviously they react and not in the best way. So all the steel brackets will be painted, and I've got on order some very thin rubber which will sit basically between the aluminium and the painted steel. Interestingly enough, a lot of the factory brackets on the Aston are steel. They've been powder coated and the powder coating has started to go bad, so they've started to react. So I think in the case of our brackets, a thick coat of paint would do much better than powder coating in the long term. Next up is the front radiator, but before we do that, I want to briefly talk about the body placement. As I'm filming this, it's the day after the last episode came out. A lot of you guys agreed that the Aston body should come forward an inch or so, making the Aston arch sit a bit more central over the Land Rover wheel. The discrepancy between the Aston wheelbase and the Land Rover wheelbase is 2.5 inches. So basically in an ideal world, we need to lose that 1.25 inches on both the rear and the front arches. Right now, the rear end is very much taking that. So moving the body forwards an inch or so, now we've got the brackets made, might sound like a big deal, but it's actually very simple. It doesn't require more fabrication. All it requires is drilling a new set of holes in the existing brackets. So let me show you. If we want to move the body forward an inch, all that means is we need to drill 4 more holes a little bit closer to the rear end of the bracket. And now taking you to the front bracket, all it requires is drilling a new hole closer to the back of the bracket. So the next thing is to reposition the radiator to allow our very low profile bonnet to sit properly. So let's get going. Well, amongst all of this destruction, we have success. As you can see, the bonnet is just resting there and it's sitting a little bit lower than it should be. But even with that, we are actually clearing. Yes, only a tiny, tiny bit, but we are completely clearing. Obviously, the fan is not going to stay like that, but yeah, the bonnet now has the space it needs to sit properly. I'm going to leave the fan for now. I know that might sound a little bit silly, but until I've got the radiator positioned, I don't want to take it off unnecessarily, as if it can stay on in its original position, that would be great. It probably can't, but we might as well try. And even though the radiator will be on an angle and therefore the fan won't be cooling it in the most efficient way, I suppose if we can keep it there and have electric fans, it's going to offer some additional cooling, potentially. But anyway, now it is time for me to make a new bracket. So I'm going to have a little bit of a clear up on the front end as it is covered in filth, water and oil, and then we will get going on the new mount. Okay, so I have the new radiator mount roughly in place and I think it's looking pretty cool. If you're wondering why it's held together by bolts and tabs, it's because at the barn I don't actually have enough power to weld, so I have to take everything back home to get it properly finalised. But overall I'm happy with how it's sitting, so let me give you a slightly closer look. You will immediately see it is not quite central, and that is because there is a rather large outlet on this side which needed to be cleared, so it is partial to the driver's side. My main goal was to use all of the Land Rover original radiator fittings to keep it in place. So as you can see, it slots in down there, and then we've got the top mounts either side. I will be putting little rubber bushes in there later down the line, but overall I'm really happy with how it sits. It gives us plenty of space to clear the bonnet, which is excellent. It is certainly not the most elegant thing, but it is very functional. Once it's all trimmed and welded up and painted, it will look great. Another thing I had to consider was the front bumper. Obviously, the new radiator mount and the radiator are now much further forward and very close to the edge of the Aston bumper. So I had to make sure that the main central beam was able to clear or go between the two portions of the Aston bumper. It fits really well, and I'll show you guys that shortly, but now let's get this thing welded up. So there we have it, the new radiator bracket is bolted in and supporting the radiator. It is far from done, like the rear mounts, it is just tacked at the moment so I can make sure it did fit. I also need to put another support beam in on this side. I couldn't do it today because I was welding back home and there was quite a lot of people around, so I thought it would be even more antisocial to get the angle grinder out as well. But regardless, I'm really pleased with the progress and it's really cool to see the radiator on this sort of angle. It really is in keeping with the theme of the build. I'm sure those of you who are watching closely will question why I have not done a support at the back, making a proper rectangle, and why it only has two mounts. Well, that's because it's not totally finished. There are lots of other things in the engine bay from the Land Rover that are just hanging loose, as you can probably see. So a couple of additional brackets need to be made coming from the Aston firewall, and I'd like to connect them to the back of this bracket. But when it's all bolted together, it will create a very rigid structure around the front end of the car for the ancillaries. But before the sun sets today, I'd like to do a couple more bits. Now we know where our radiator is sitting, I'd like to properly mount the wings, put the bumper back on, and also the hinges have arrived for the bonnet, so I'd like to get that on. So let's see if we can do that before the sun sets. Well, there we have it. It has been a productive episode. We got both the body mounts done, the radiator mount, and the complete front end is on. As you can see, the sun is setting. Unfortunately, there was no more time for me to do the tonneau cover and the dash frame today, but you will see that next week. It is really exciting to have a proper front end. Unfortunately though, as you can probably see, this bonnet might be a bit too twisted to use. It is so much higher on that side than it is this side. I've tried messing with it, but that is as good as I can get it. So a new bonnet might be in order. Not only is it twisted up there, but the front is obviously completely crumpled. I could deal with that on its own, but the twisting across the whole bonnet might be a little bit too much. But overall, it's so exciting to have a front end that is on with more than just zip ties and resting things. Obviously, a lot of fine tuning is still needed, but it has been a productive session. Next week, I will be back and the goal is to build a completely custom floor. get the dash frame in. In the meantime, I am going to mess around with the placement of the body a little bit, so you'll see the results of that next week as well. If you enjoyed the video, and even if you didn't, please like, share and subscribe. It really does help me out. If you'd like to support the channel further, please do check out the Patreon below. It's where I post behind the scenes, early access and all that fun. But regardless, I am just pleased you're here. So again, thank you for watching, and until next time, take care, and I'll see you then. Oh, please come in.